The Galactic Council's convocation hall had never seemed so small to diplomat Kael'thor. 347 cycles of service to the United Stars Coalition had taught him to read rooms the way others read data on holoprojectors. The recycled air carried a chemical trace that his dermal sensors identified as alien adrenaline, that primitive substance young species still produced when facing threats. But there shouldn't be any threats here. Not today. The human delegation had arrived punctually, as was expected of any species applying for formal entry into the coalition. Standard protocol, diplomatic introductions, demonstration of defensive capabilities, signing of non-aggression treaties. Kael'thor had conducted this ritual 43 times in his career, always without incident, always predictable. But something was wrong. His four eyes focused on the terrestrial entourage as they passed through the biometric verification arch. 5 individuals, 2 diplomats in formal attire that shimmered under the chamber's bluish lighting, clearly uncomfortable with the artificial gravity calibrated to the galactic standard. A scientist carrying a data device that blinked with green lights. A naval officer in an impeccable uniform, upright posture, hands clasped behind his back. And him, the 5th human. Kael'thor felt his dorsal ridges involuntarily bristle, a reaction he hadn't experienced since his days as a young explorer in the unmapped reaches of the galaxy. The individual was shorter than the other humans, compact but dense build, a different uniform, in earthy green and brown tones, without the golden adornments the others displayed. 3 stripes on the sleeves, no visible medals. But it was the eyes that disturbed Kael'thor. Brown, calm, meticulously scanning every corner of the hall with a precision that went beyond mere curiosity, calculating distances, identifying exits, assessing threats. Kael'thor recognized that look because he had seen it before on savage worlds where creatures at the top of the food chain assess their prey. It was the look of a predator. Supreme Counselor Valara, a silver-skinned Tilani with a harmonic voice, began the formalities with her characteristic diplomatic smile. Representatives of the human species from the planet Earth, Sol system. The United Stars Coalition welcomes you with peace and fraternity. Your journey from the depths of your home system to these sacred chambers demonstrates admirable courage and determination. The human diplomat, identified as Ambassador Victoria Chen, bowed slightly. Supreme Counselor, members of the High Council, it is an honor to be here. Humanity extends its gratitude for the opportunity to join the galactic community. Kael'thor watched the protocol unfold. Introductions, planetary histories, demonstration of civilian technologies, everything perfectly rehearsed, but his eyes kept returning to the 5th human, who remained in absolute silence, hands relaxed at his sides, but with an immobility that seemed more controlled than natural. Finally, the part Kael'thor feared arrived. Admission Protocol Section 7, Valara announced, her voice echoing through the universal translators. Demonstration of defensive capabilities. As a candidate species, you must present the Council with a complete analysis of your military forces, command structures, and engagement protocols. This is not a hostile requirement, but a practical necessity. Knowing the capabilities of our members allows us to coordinate effective defenses against external threats. Ambassador Chen nodded to the 5th human. Supreme Counselor, members of the Council, allow me to introduce Sergeant Marcus Hayes, infantry of the United States Marine Corps of Earth. He will provide the requested information. The human stepped forward, without hesitation, without nervousness. His voice, when he spoke, was low and devoid of excessive emotion. Counselors, I am here to answer your questions regarding terrestrial defense forces. Counselor Vrix, a Corthan with a blue chitinous exoskeleton, tilted his triangular head. Sergeant Hayes, how many training cycles are required to produce a standard infantry soldier in your species? Hayes did not blink. 14 weeks for basic training. Depending on the specialization, an additional 4 to 12 weeks of advanced training. Silence. Kael'thor saw Vrix's auditory membranes vibrate in confusion. Among the Coalition species, the minimum time to train a warrior was 2 standard galactic years. The Corthan themselves, known for their military efficiency, took 3 years. 14 weeks was impossible. It had to be a translation error. Pardon me, interjected Councillor Matara, a silicate whose crystalline form emitted red reflections when agitated. Did you say 14 cycles? Weeks, Councillor. Approximately 98 standard terrestrial days. That is absurd, Vrix declared, his voice filled with disbelief. No species can train a functional combatant in less than 1 full cycle of seasons. Hayes remained impassive. I cannot speak for other species, Councillor. I can only report our procedures. Kael'thor intervened for the first time, his rough voice cutting through the rising tension. Sergeant Hayes, explain the process. What can be taught in such a short time? The human turned slightly, focusing his brown eyes directly on Kael'thor. For a moment, the veteran diplomat felt something primal awaken in his gut. Recognition? This being was not prey. Intensive physical conditioning? Hayes began, his voice methodical like a technical report. Cardiovascular endurance, muscular strength, pain tolerance, training in firearms, explosives, hand-to-hand combat, terrestrial navigation in multiple biomes, survival in hostile environments, combat first aid, squad tactics, communication protocols, operation of specialized equipment. Each item was recited without emphasis, but the list grew like an inexorable wave. Matara pulsed bright red. Pain tolerance? Does that imply you are injured during training? Accidents happen, Counselor. Furthermore, it is necessary to know how to function while injured. Function? Vrix's voice rose an octave. Your forces operate while injured? Yes, sir. A soldier can continue fighting with non-lethal injuries. It is expected that they do so. Kael'thor felt his dorsal ridges bristle again. In the Coalition, wounded combatants were immediately evacuated for medical treatment. The idea of forcing them to continue was considered barbaric by most member species. Ambassador Chen raised a hand discreetly, trying to smooth the situation. Counselors, understand that our species evolved on a planet with extremely varied conditions. We developed resilience as a survival mechanism. Resilience, echoed Valara, her voice losing its characteristic harmony. Sergeant Hayes, how many standard infantry soldiers does your species maintain active? Hayes did not hesitate. Approximately 3,200,000 in active global service, about 20 million in trained reserve. The hall erupted in murmurs. 23 million trained combatants. The Coalition's entire defense fleet numbered 800,000 military personnel, and that covered 400 star systems. Kael'thor rose from his chair, his imposing stature silencing the murmurs. Do these numbers include your elite forces? your specialized operators? And then something happened that Kael'thor would never forget. Sergeant Marcus Hayes smiled. It was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who knew a terrible secret and knew you were not ready to hear it. "No, sir," Hayes replied, his voice maintaining that disturbing professional calm. "Those are just our regular soldiers. Special forces are a completely different category." The silence that followed was so dense that Kael'thor could hear it pressing against his auditory membranes. He knew at that moment that his initial unease was not paranoia. It was survival instinct. Because if those millions of soldiers trained in weeks were just the common front line, what exactly were the elite forces? Valara broke the silence, her voice carefully controlled. "Sergeant Hayes, elaborate on these special forces." Hayes looked directly at her. "With all due respect, Counselor, that information is classified for coalition candidates. If we are accepted as full members, protocols may be reviewed." Kael'thor felt a chill run down his spine. 347 cycles of diplomacy had taught him a fundamental truth. When a young species refuses to share its most dangerous weapons, it is because they are truly terrifying. And as he watched Sergeant Marcus Hayes return to his position beside the delegation, immobile and vigilant like a statue of living stone, Kael'thor made a decision. He needed to find out exactly what humanity was hiding before it was too late. The council session had been suspended for a 6-hour standard galactic interval, enough time for members to digest the information presented. Kael'thor had not moved from his private workstation on the upper levels of the council tower. Instead, he had plunged into a deep analysis of publicly available data about Earth. What he found did not comfort him. His 3-dimensional hologram displayed maps of the human planet, a blue and white world of singular beauty. But it was not the aesthetics that held his attention. It was the numbers, the terrible and impossible numbers. "Analysis system," Kael'thor commanded, his voice echoing in the private chamber. "Compile statistics on armed conflicts in recorded human history." The Coalition's artificial intelligence processed the request instantly. Data flowed across the holographic screen in cascades of bluish light. Number of documented wars in the last 5,000 terrestrial years, over 14,000. Kael'thor felt his auditory membranes vibrate in shock. 14,000 conflicts. The entire Coalition, in 20,000 years of combined history of all member species, had recorded approximately 800 significant conflicts. "Refine the search," he ordered, his voice tense. "Conflicts in the last 200 terrestrial years. 2 global conflicts categorized as world wars. Estimated casualties, over 100 million individuals. 100 million. The Coalition's entire population was approximately 80 billion. The loss of 100 million would be considered an extinction catastrophe for most species. Humans had lost that number in less than a century and still had 8 billion individuals alive on their planet. "Analysis of population recovery capacity," Kael'thor murmured, almost to himself. The data painted an even more disturbing picture. After each massive conflict, the human population not only recovered, but grew exponentially. Resilience was not a military characteristic. It was a fundamental biological characteristic of the species. A communication signal interrupted his thoughts. The holographic face of Counselor Valara materialized before him, her silver features marked by concern. Kyle Thor, I need your honest assessment, she said without preamble. You have served on more first contact missions than any other living diplomat. Your experience was direct in your last message. Do you truly believe humans pose a threat? Kyle Thor considered his words carefully. Counselor, after 3 centuries of service, I have learned that threat is not always defined by hostile intent. Sometimes it is simply a matter of uncontrolled capability. Explain. Humans are young, Counselor. Technologically, they have barely developed superluminal travel. Socially, they still maintain separate nation-states instead of a unified planetary government. But militarily? Kyle Thor paused, choosing his words with surgical precision. Militarily, they have surpassed civilizations with 10 times their development time. Valara pulsed in anxious blue tones. Is the data you sent about their historical conflicts accurate? Verified through 3 independent sources, including their own public transmissions. Counselor, they document their wars. They make films about them. They study battle tactics from thousands of years ago as if they were applicable lessons today. That is aberrant. That is evolutionary adaptation, Kyle Thor corrected. A species that never forgets how to fight, never loses the capacity to do so. Valara's face showed the Talani equivalent of a sigh. The council is divided. Vrix and the Korthan faction want to deny human entry based on security concerns. Matara and the Silicates argue that isolating them could create future hostility. I am in the middle, trying to find wisdom where there is only uncertainty. Kyle Thor activated a second hologram, displaying the technical specifications Hayes had provided about standard terrestrial weaponry. Counselor, allow me to add another data point to your deliberation. Standard human assault rifles fire chemical projectiles at speeds exceeding 1,000 meters per second. Pure kinetic energy, no need for power cells or generators. Primitive weapons, Valara observed, though her voice lacked conviction. Primitive, but effective, and infinitely simpler to maintain than plasma or particle beam weapons. A human soldier can carry enough ammunition for sustained combat for days. Our energy weapons need to be recharged every 15 shots. Valara closed her multiple eyes, processing the information. Are you suggesting that their technological simplicity is a strategic advantage? I am stating that it is. Complexity creates vulnerability. Humans built their combat systems based on reliability under extreme conditions. It works in a vacuum, it works submerged, it works in temperatures that would kill most of us. A heavy silence hung between them until Valara finally verbalized the question they both avoided. What do you think would happen if we denied their entry into the coalition? Kyle Thor did not answer immediately. Instead, he enlarged the image of Sergeant Hayes, captured during the previous session. Those brown, calm, and calculating eyes filled the hologram. Honestly, Counselor, I'm not sure, but I can tell you what wouldn't happen. They wouldn't surrender, they wouldn't disappear, and they certainly wouldn't forget. Valara disconnected the transmission without further words, leaving Kyle Thor alone with his thoughts and growing data. Hours later, when the doors of the session chamber opened again, Kyle Thor had made a decision. He would approach the humans directly, not as a council diplomat, but as an individual seeking understanding. The terrestrial delegation was housed in the visitors sector, a luxurious module designed to make candidate species feel welcome. Kyle Thor found Ambassador Chen in an artificial garden, observing terrestrial plants they had brought as a diplomatic gift. "Ambassador Chen," Kael'thor greeted, using the formal human protocol of inclining his head. She turned, surprise evident in her features. "Diplomat Kael'thor, I didn't expect visitors at this hour. I apologize for the intrusion. There are matters that need to be discussed outside the formal council environment." Chen studied him for a moment before nodding. "Matters concerning our presentation today, I presume? About your Sergeant Hayes, specifically." An almost imperceptible smile touched the ambassador's lips. "He made quite an impression, didn't he? He caused alarm, Ambassador, and in the Galactic Council, alarm leads to decisions that may not be favorable to human interests." Chen gestured to a nearby bench, inviting Kael'thor to sit. When both were settled, she spoke with a frankness the diplomat appreciated. "Diplomat Kael'thor, may I ask a direct question?" "Please do." "How many species in the Coalition developed star travel capability while still possessing nation-states competing for resources?" Kael'thor considered the question. "None. Most species achieve planetary unification centuries before developing superluminal technology." "Exactly," Chen said, her voice soft but firm. "We are an anomaly. We reach the stars while still fighting among ourselves. And do you know what that taught us? That you are innate warriors?" "No," Chen shook her head. "It taught us the cost of war. Every human conflict documented in our archives is also a lesson about the price of conflict. We study our wars not to glorify them, but to understand how to avoid them." Kael'thor remained skeptical. "Yet you maintain millions of trained soldiers." "Because we learned another important lesson. Peace is not the absence of the capacity to fight. It is the choice not to do so when you could." The logic was circular, but not without merit. Kael'thor changed tactics. Sergeant Hayes mentioned special forces, forces that, according to him, are trained for the impossible. The Council needs to understand what that means. Chen sighed, a very human expression of resignation. "I do not have the authority to disclose classified operations, diplomat, but I can share a personal story if that helps. Any context would be valuable." The ambassador looked up at the artificial sky above them, where holographic stars twinkled in patterns that mimicked real space. "My grandfather was one of those special soldiers, Army Special Forces operator, 62 missions in 16 different countries. When he finally retired and came home, do you know what he did?" Kael'thor waited in silence. "He became a kindergarten teacher. He spent his days teaching 5-year-olds how to tie their shoes and share toys. He was the kindest man I ever met. Patient, thoughtful, incapable of raising his voice. And yet, he was a lethal warrior." "He was both, diplomat. That is the part that species who never needed to fight for their survival perhaps do not understand. The capacity for violence and the choice of peace are not mutually exclusive. They coexist, and in the best of us, the latter governs the former." Kael'thor processed the words carefully. There was wisdom there, but also danger. A species capable of switching between kindness and lethality without internal conflict was unpredictable by definition. "Ambassador, the Council will vote on your species admission soon. My recommendation carries significant weight. I need to know, with complete honesty, if we accept humanity into the Coalition, can we trust that your military capability will be used only defensively Chen stared directly at him, her dark eyes reflecting the same calculating intensity Kael'thor had seen in Haze. "Diplomat Kael'thor, if you accept us, we will take an oath. And when humans take oaths, we keep them, even when it costs everything." It was not the absolute guarantee Kael'thor sought, but he recognized the truth in it. And truth, he had learned in 3 centuries of diplomacy, was more valuable than empty promises. "Thank you for your frankness, Ambassador." As Kael'thor returned to his quarters, an urgent notification flashed on his personal communicator. Vrix had called an emergency council session. The reason? A crisis had erupted in the mining colonies of the peripheral system, and someone had suggested requesting human assistance. The Galactic Council's emergency session chamber was buzzing with palpable tension. 3-dimensional holograms floated above the central table, displaying real-time data from the peripheral system. Kael'thor studied the images with growing concern as he took his position among the counselors. The Kerdal system, known in human records as Epsilon Eridani, was a cluster of 7 planets, rich in rare minerals, essential for warp drive technology. 3 mining colonies with a combined population of 4,200,000 individuals from 17 different species sustained the economy of the Coalition's outer rim, or sustained it until 72 hours ago. "Situation summary," Valara ordered, her harmonic voice now sharp as a blade. Admiral Takos, a green-scaled Valorian, activated the data sequence. At 0300 hours standard, insurgent forces took control of mining station Delta 6. Command and control established. Emergency transmissions were blocked. When we managed to re-establish contact through secondary channels, the rebels had already fortified positions in all critical sectors. Vrix slammed his chitinous claws on the table. "How many insurgents?" "Current estimates, 40,000 combatants." The number echoed through the chamber like a physical blow. Kael'thor saw the dorsal ridges of several counselors bristle in poorly contained panic. 40,000, repeated Matara, her crystalline form pulsing, orange-red. How was this possible? Our intelligence networks did not detect mobilization of this scale. Takos displayed additional data. Forensic analysis suggests gradual infiltration over 2 standard years. Maintenance workers, support technicians, logistics operators, all with legitimate credentials, all waiting for the signal to act simultaneously. Kael'thor studied the tactical patterns displayed on the holograms. The coordination was impressive. Every move calculated to maximize territorial control while minimizing initial response. Whoever was commanding the insurgents understood positional warfare with mastery. "Our response forces?" Valara asked. "The regional defense fleet is 96 hours away," Takos replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "Even at maximum warp speed, we won't arrive for 4 standard days. And when we do arrive, we will face a significant problem." "Elaborate." The Admiral zoomed in on the mining station image. The massive structure orbited a gas giant, its extraction modules penetrating deep into the planet's atmosphere. The rebels are using the civilian workers as shields. Orbital bombardment would eliminate the threat, but it would kill 4 million innocents. Direct assault with our conventional forces would result in massive casualties on both sides. Heavy silence enveloped the council. Kael'thor knew the brutal mathematics of fortified urban combat. The Coalition simply did not possess forces trained for large-scale rescue operations against entrenched defenders. Their military doctrines favored naval engagement in open space, not infiltration into compromised structures. It was then that Ambassador Chen spoke from the observer's sector, where the human delegation awaited the conclusion of the vote on their admission. Supreme Counselor, if I may, all attention turned to the human. Valara hesitated before nodding. Ambassador Chen, this is a closed security session. I understand, Counselor, but I have heard the description of the situation, and I believe humanity can offer assistance. Vrix emitted a sound that translated roughly as bitter laughter. Ambassador, with all due respect, your species barely possesses 3 interstellar combat vessels. What exactly could you offer against 40,000 fortified combatants? Chen remained impassive. 300 soldiers. The silence that followed was not one of shock, but of absolute confusion. Matara was the first to verbalize the collective thought. 300 against 40,000? That is suicide, not strategy. With permission, Counselor, Chen continued, her voice gaining a tone of absolute certainty. 300 Special Forces operators, trained specifically for this type of scenario. Infiltration, sabotage, hostage rescue in hostile environments. It is literally what they exist for. Kael'thor felt his auditory membranes vibrate. The Special Forces, the ones Hayes had refused to detail, the ones trained for the impossible. Valara leaned forward, her silver features marked by genuine interest, mixed with skepticism. Ambassador, explain how 300 individuals could neutralize a defensive force 200 times larger without causing massive civilian casualties. Chen gestured to Sergeant Hayes, who had remained in absolute silence until that moment. The soldier stepped forward, his posture as controlled as it had been in the first presentation. Counselors, Hayes began, his voice devoid of arrogance, but filled with professional confidence. Allow me to introduce the concept of surgical precision operations. He activated a terrestrial data device, projecting a hologram that synchronized with the Coalition system. The mining station appeared again, but now overlaid with tactical markings that Kael'thor recognized from his own youthful military training. Phase 1. Silent insertion. Non-motorized infiltration capsules, launched from beyond the radar detection perimeter, drifting in the vacuum, utilizing orbital gravity for approach. No thermal signature, no electromagnetic emissions. Invisible until the moment of contact. Hayes zoomed in on a sector of the station. Phase 2. Identification and neutralization of command. The rebels have a hierarchical structure. We find the central command, we cut off the head. Without coordination, 40,000 combatants become fragmented groups without unified direction. And how would you locate the central command in a structure with millions of cubic meters? DeCoste challenged. Hayes looked directly at the Admiral. Analysis of communication patterns. Every army, no matter how disciplined, has a detectable flow of orders. We track the source. Furthermore, insurgent leaders tend to occupy superior defensive positions with multiple escape routes. We look for architectural patterns that favor these characteristics. Kael'thor realized he was watching a masterclass in asymmetric warfare delivered by someone who had clearly participated in similar operations. The brutal simplicity of the strategy was both elegant and terrifying. Phase 3, Hayes continued, zooming in on another sector. Sabotage of critical infrastructure, power systems, communications, life support. We do not destroy. We temporarily disable. We create controlled chaos. We force the insurgents to move, to react, to make mistakes. Wouldn't that put civilians at risk? Matara questioned. On the contrary, Counselor, our operators are trained to work in dense population environments. Every action is calculated to minimize collateral damage. We disable power in military sectors, maintain life, support in civilian areas. We cut insurgent communications, preserve emergency channels for non-combatants. Valara studied the hologram with increasing intensity. Sergeant Hayes, be completely honest. What is the probability of success for this operation? Hayes did not hesitate. If we are given full access to the station schematics, real-time population data, and authorization for independent operational command, 85% successful neutralization with minimal civilian casualties. And your own casualties? For the first time, Kael'thor saw something that might be emotion cross the sergeant's face. It was not fear. It was grim acceptance. Operations of this nature have a historical mortality rate of 20 to 30% among operators. We anticipate losing between 60 and 90 soldiers. The casualness with which Hayes discussed the death of his own comrades sent shockwaves through the chamber. For most coalition species, preemptively accepting significant casualties was inconceivable. Battles were avoided precisely because every lost life was considered a catastrophic failure. But humans calculated these losses as expected variables in a larger equation. Brix rose from his chair, his chitinous form trembling with indignation. This is barbarism, sending 300 individuals knowing that 30% will die is inhumane. Hayes turned to Vrix, and Kael'thor saw that predator's gaze again, calm, relentless. With all due respect, Counselor, it is exactly the opposite. Every operator who volunteers for high-risk missions does so knowing the risks. They do so because they understand that their life, weighed against 4 million civilians, is a trade worth making. That is not barbarism, that is sacrifice. The silence that followed was so dense that Kael'thor could feel the weight of it pressing against his dorsal ridges. It was Ambassador Chen who broke the moment. Counselors, humanity offers this assistance without conditions, not as a bargain for admission to the coalition, not as a demonstration of power, but because it is the right thing to do. 4 million lives are at risk. We have the capacity to save them, and if we do not try, we will carry that weight for the rest of our existence. Valara looked around the chamber, reading the expressions of her fellow counselors. Fear, hope, distrust, despair, all mixed in an emotional cauldron that threatened to paralyze the decision. Kael'thor made a decision. He rose, his imposing stature commanding attention. Supreme Counselor, members of the Council, 347 cycles of service have taught me to recognize when pragmatism must overcome protocol. We have no better options. Our fleet will arrive too late. Our forces are not trained for this type of operation. The humans are. He paused, letting his words settle. I formally propose that we accept terrestrial assistance under independent operational command, with coalition observers documenting the procedures for future analysis. The vote was swift. 7 in favor, 3 against, 2 abstaining. Valara nodded solemnly. Ambassador Chen, Sergeant Hayes, the coalition accepts your offer. What measures need to be taken immediately? Hayes was already moving before the question was fully formed. We need complete station schematics, profiles of all workers to identify possible infiltrated insurgents, and access to a secure communication channel with our command vessel. Granted. As the human delegation left the chamber at a brisk pace, Kael'thor watched Sergeant Hayes coordinate communications through a device that seemed primitive compared to Coalition technology, but functioned with impeccable efficiency. And for the first time in 3 centuries, Kael'thor wondered if the fear he had felt upon meeting the humans was not fear of them, but fear that the galaxy would never be the same after the universe discovered what humanity was capable of. Kael'thor had never been in a human military operations room. The experience was disconcerting in its brutal simplicity. While Coalition command centers were designed with multi-species ergonomics, soft lighting, and elegant holographic interfaces, the advanced Tactical Command Center of the terrestrial vessel HMS Resolute seemed to have been built with a single purpose: absolute efficiency. Flat screens displayed data in 2-dimensional format. Human operators worked at modular stations that could be quickly reconfigured. There were no comfortable seats, only functional chairs. The lighting was bright and clinical, and the ambient sound was a constant murmur of precise communications without a wasted word. Contact confirmed with all infiltration teams, reported Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, a medium-height human with black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Capsules launched 17 minutes ago. Estimated time to impact, 43 minutes. Kael'thor watched the monitors displaying 300 luminous red dots on a slow trajectory towards Station Delta 6. Each dot represented a human soldier, encapsulated in a coffin-sized infiltration capsule, drifting in the vacuum without active propulsion, invisible to insurgent detection systems. "Allow me to fully understand," Kael'thor said, his voice filled with careful incredulity. "Your soldiers are floating in space, inside non-motorized containers, relying entirely on the ballistic calculations to reach the target?" Captain James Rodriguez, the operation commander, nodded without taking his eyes off the monitors. "Correct, diplomat. Stealth infiltration capsules. No engines, no emissions, no detectable signatures, just precisely calculated trajectories and a lot of patience. And if the calculations are incorrect, then the operators will use their spacesuit propulsion systems for minor course corrections. But that increases the risk of detection, so it is avoided whenever possible." Kael'thor studied the data with growing attention. The trajectories were masterpieces of applied mathematics, utilizing micro-variations in the gas giant's gravitational field to adjust courses without active propulsion. Each capsule followed a unique path calculated to converge at specific entry points simultaneously. "How often is this type of infiltration performed?" Kael'thor asked. Mitchell replied without looking at him. "Orbital infiltration operations? Approximately 40 times per standard terrestrial year in training exercises. In real combat, this will be the 23rd documented operation in the last 8 years. 23 times. 23 times human soldiers had launched themselves into the vacuum inside metallic coffins, staking their lives on mathematical calculations and precise coordination." A soft alarm echoed through the operations room. Rodriguez leaned over his station. "Auditory contact established. Commander, Frost is online." A female voice, clear and devoid of detectable stress, filled the speakers. "Command Center, this is Frost. All teams reporting nominal systems. Internal capsule temperature, -8 degrees Celsius. Oxygen levels, 92%. Average team heart rate, 62 beats per minute. Kyle Thor felt his dorsal ridges bristle, 62 beats per minute. These soldiers were floating in the vacuum of space, in freezing containers, heading toward a station controlled by 40,000 hostiles, and their heart rates were at relaxed, resting levels. Understood, Frost, Rodriguez replied. Preparation status? All teams green. Weaponry checked. Communications systems operational. Explosives and sabotage equipment ready for implementation, awaiting confirmation of final intelligence data. Mitchell rapidly typed commands. Sending intelligence package now. Updated thermal mapping of the station. Location of vital sign concentrations. Insurgent communication patterns identified in the last 6 hours. Received. Analyzing. Kyle Thor watched as the humans worked with choreographed efficiency. Every movement had purpose. Every communication was economical in words, but rich in information. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing of decisions, just professional execution of a plan, rehearsed thousands of times. Diplomat Kyle Thor, Frost's voice emerged from the speakers, surprising him. I understand you are observing this operation as a representative of the Galactic Council. That is correct, Commander Frost. Then allow me to clarify something important. What you are about to witness does not represent the pinnacle of human military capabilities. It represents the minimum standard we expect from our elite operators. I mention this not out of arrogance, but to properly contextualize what will be documented. Kyle Thor processed the words carefully. Minimum standard. This impossible operation, this superhuman coordination, this calm acceptance of mortal risk was the minimum standard. I understand, Commander. I appreciate the clarification. 30 minutes to impact, Mitchell announced. Rodriguez activated an additional monitor, displaying video feed transmitted from one of the infiltration capsules. Kyle Thor saw the claustrophobic interior of the container, where a human soldier was accommodated in a fetal position, surrounded by equipment packed with military precision. The soldier wore a helmet with a transparent visor, through which Kyle Thor could see a young face, perhaps 25 terrestrial years old, with a serene expression of concentration. Operator Chen, Mitchell identified upon noticing Kyle Thor's interest. Demolition Specialist, 28 years old, 6 years of service, 42 combat operations, 42 operations at 28 years old. Kyle Thor had lived 347 cycles and participated in precisely 0 direct combat situations. The video feed showed Chen systematically checking her explosives, her fingers moving with the familiarity of perfect muscle memory, without haste, but without hesitation. Every movement had purpose. 15 minutes to impact. Kyle Thor realized the operations room had become quieter. The operators continued working, but there was a growing intensity, an absolute focus that permeated the environment like static electricity. Command Center, this is Frost. Final preparation initiated. All teams confirming hot armament. Emergency propulsion systems on standby. Breach protocols activated. Rodriguez leaned over his console. Confirmed, Frost. You have green authorization for all operational phases. Remind your team, Priority 1 is preservation of civilian lives. Priority 2 is neutralization of insurgent command. Priority 3 is dismantling of enemy organizational structure. Understood. Priorities confirmed and communicated. 10 minutes to impact. Mitchell zoomed in on the visual feed, now showing multiple perspectives from different capsules. Thor could see Station Delta 6 growing in the visors, a massive structure of metal and ceramic that shone under the light of the nearby gas giant. Command Center, detecting insurgent radar sweep. Standard search pattern. No specific focus. We remain undetected. Excellent. Maintain emission silence until confirmed breach. 5 minutes to impact. Thor realized he was holding his breath. He forced himself to breathe normally, but his attention was completely absorbed by the monitors. 300 soldiers converging in absolute silence on a fortified station. 2 minutes. The video feeds showed the soldiers adjusting their positions inside the capsules, preparing for impact. Chen held a detonation device in one hand, the other resting on a compact rifle magnetically attached to the capsule wall. 1 minute. All teams, final status confirmation. A cascade of confirmations flowed through the communication channels, every operator reporting green. Ready, focused. 30 seconds. The silence in the operations room was absolute now. Even the murmur of secondary communications had ceased. 10 seconds. 9, 8. Thor saw Chen close her eyes for a brief moment. Not in fear, the diplomat realized, but in mental preparation, centering herself for the chaos she was about to unleash. 3, 2, 1. Impact. The monitors exploded into activity. 300 red dots converged simultaneously on the station. Video feeds showed soldiers blasting out of their capsules, moving with speed and precision that defied physics in artificial gravity. All teams confirming successful penetration. 0 casualties on impact. Initiating Phase 2, deep infiltration. And then, as Thor watched 300 human soldiers disappear into the dark corridors of Station Delta 6, like predatory ghosts, he understood a fundamental truth. Humanity had not reached the stars despite its violent nature. It had reached the stars because they had mastered the art of applying violence with surgical precision when all other options failed, and the galaxy, for better or worse, would never be the same. The first 15 minutes of the operation passed in near absolute silence. Thor watched the monitors with increasing intensity as 300 human data points dispersed through the station like ink in water, infiltrating ventilation systems, maintenance ducts, and peripheral corridors with ghostly efficiency. Command Center, this is Team Alpha 7. Established position in Maintenance Duct Sector 17. Direct visual of insurgent patrol, counting 12 hostiles, armed with modified Corthan plasma rifles, awaiting engagement order. Rodriguez studied the data feed before responding. Negative on engagement, Alpha 7. Maintain observation and continue infiltration. Priority is to reach infrastructure objectives without general alert. Understood. Continuing movement. Thor felt a profound disturbance. 12 armed insurgents, less than 16 feet away from a team of human operators, and the order was to avoid engagement. The discipline required to observe enemies without acting was something most warrior species considered nearly impossible. Mitchell pointed to one of the main monitors. Ambassador, observe the dispersion pattern. Each team of 3 operators has specific objectives based on the station's network analysis. We aren't just invading. We are executing a systematic dismantling plan. Thor studied the pattern. Mitchell was right. The teams were converging on critical infrastructure nodes, auxiliary power generators, communications hubs, data processing centers, life support control stations, command center, Team Bravo 3. we've reached the North Auxiliary Generator, initiating installation of shape charges for deactivation without permanent destruction. Confirmed. Bravo 3. Estimated time for preparation: 7 minutes for full installation. Remote detonation ready when ordered. Another monitor showed video feed of Chen and her team working on a communications hub. Their movements were meticulous, almost delicate, as she connected sabotage devices to control panels. Not brute destruction, but surgical disabling. Fascinating, Kael'thor murmured. They aren't destroying systems. They are creating controlled failure points. Rodriguez nodded without taking his eyes off the monitors. Destruction is easy, Ambassador. Anyone can blow things up, but disabling systems so they can be quickly brought back online after the operation? That requires precision and advanced technical knowledge. Every one of these operators has systems engineering training on top of their combat skills. How many systems do they need to compromise before initiating the main assault? 17 critical nodes. Once those systems fail simultaneously, the insurgent organizational structure will collapse. No centralized communications, no backup power, no atmosphere control in military sectors. They'll become isolated groups fighting in the dark. Kael'thor processed the strategy. This wasn't war in the traditional sense the Coalition understood. It was organizational surgery, identifying the vital organs of a command structure and removing them with absolute precision. Command Center, this is Frost. My team has reached the priority objective. Visual confirmation of the Insurgent Command Center. Central Sector, Level 42. Counting 27 individuals, including high-value targets based on behavioral analysis and deference patterns. The tension in the operations room instantly intensified. Rodriguez leaned over his console. Frost, confirmed target composition. Visualizing 3 Corthan individuals in central command positions, multiple monitors displaying station security feeds, active communications. This is definitely command and control. Requesting permission for neutralization preparation. Rodriguez looked at Kael'thor. Ambassador, this is the decisive moment. Once we initiate command neutralization, there's no turning back. The operation goes kinetic across the entire station. Kael'thor studied the displayed data. 17 critical nodes compromised. 300 operators strategically positioned. 4 million civilians depending on the success of this mission. The math was brutal in its simplicity. Captain Rodriguez, you have the Galactic Council's authorization to proceed. Rodriguez nodded once. Decisive. All teams, this is Command Center. Execute Phase 3 on my mark. Frost, you have tactical control. Initiate when ready. Understood. All teams. Final preparation. Sabotage charge detonation in 30 seconds on my mark. Neutralization teams, confirm positions. Kael'thor watched as the 300 data points on the monitors stopped moving, freezing in carefully. Selected positions throughout the station. Every operator exactly where they needed to be. 10 seconds. All teams green. Chen appeared on one of the video feeds, hand over the detonator, eyes fixed on a timer in her helmet display. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, execute. What followed was a symphony of controlled chaos. Simultaneous explosions echoed through the station, not massive detonations, but focused energy pulses that fried circuits without breaching hulls. Lights flickered and died in strategic sectors. Insurgent communication systems failed instantly. Auxiliary generators shut down in a planned cascade. And in the insurgent command center, three things happened simultaneously. The doors automatically sealed, emergency systems responding to the widespread power failure. The lights went out, plunging the compartment into absolute darkness. And 6 human operators, equipped with advanced night vision, entered through ventilation conduits they had silently cut during the last 20 minutes. Kyle Thor watched the night vision video feed, where green ghosts moved with lethal precision. No shots fired, no screams, just coordinated movements that neutralized 27 insurgents in under 45 seconds using close-quarters combat tactics and non-lethal munitions the humans called flashbangs. Command Center, this is Frost. Primary objective secured. 3 high-value targets captured alive. 0 casualties on this team. Establishing defensive perimeter. Rodriguez allowed himself a brief smile. Excellent work, Frost. All other teams, report status. Communications flowed through the channels as teams confirmed success on their respective objectives. 17 out of 17 infrastructure targets neutralized, 4 secondary communication centers compromised, 6 armaments depots disabled. But it was the next report that sent shockwaves through the operations room. Command Center, this is Team Delta 9. We've located approximately 300 civilians detained in a converted cargo bay, Sector 23. Insurgent guards are panicking due to system failures, requesting permission for immediate rescue operation. Kyle Thor saw Rodriguez exchange glances with Mitchell. Rescuing hostages during an active combat operation multiplied the complexity exponentially. Delta 9. Assess hostile force composition. Visualizing 8 guards, armed but disorganized. They present no coordinated threat in the current darkness. Rodriguez made the decision in 3 seconds. Permission granted. Execute rescue. Absolute priority. 0 civilian casualties. Understood. Initiating. The video feed showed Team Delta 9 moving like shadows. 4 operators neutralized the guards with clinical efficiency, while 2 others cut the locks on the detention compartment. When the doors opened, Kyle Thor saw terrified faces of multiple species blinking under emergency lighting. A human operator, identified as Sergeant Williams, activated a universal translator and spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. "My name is Sergeant Williams. Terrestrial Rescue Forces, we are here to get you out. We need you to remain calm and follow our instructions exactly. Is anyone here injured and in need of immediate medical attention?" Kyle Thor observed the 300 civilians, including 50 children of various species, being systematically processed, assessed, and prepared for evacuation. The human operators worked with professional efficiency, but Kyle Thor noticed something more: kindness, deliberate care when interacting with the terrified. One operator knelt to speak at eye level with a Silicata child, offering reassuring words. Command Center, Delta 9. 300 civilians confirmed safe. 3 require medical attention, but nothing critical. Establishing evacuation route to safe sector Alpha. Rodriguez marked the route on his console. Confirmed. Teams Echo 2 and Echo 5 establish secure corridor for civilian evacuation from Sector 23 to safe sector Alpha. Understood. Corridor being established. Mitchell updated the tactical display. Commander, we are receiving reports of massive disorganization among insurgent forces. Without central command and communications, groups are surrendering to station security units that are reorganizing. Kyle Thor watched the tactical map show real-time changes. Red representing insurgent forces, fragmenting into smaller and smaller pockets. Green, representing areas controlled by human operators and station security personnel, systematically expanding. Command Center, this is Frost. We've begun preliminary interrogation of captured commanders. Initial intel suggests insurgent leadership expected external assistance that never arrived. Morale is collapsing rapidly. Rodriguez studied the data before making his next decision. All teams initiate Phase 4, consolidation. Work with station security personnel to accept organized surrenders. Priority remains preservation of life. Lethal measures only in direct defense. The next 2 hours transpired in a methodical cleanup operation. Human operators coordinated with local security forces. Established surrender points, processed prisoners, and gradually restored critical systems. When Commander Frost finally reported the operation complete, the final numbers appeared on the main monitor. Insurgents neutralized, 40,300. Civilian casualties, 17, all due to pre-existing medical conditions unrelated to combat. Human operator casualties, 4 wounded, none fatal. Kale Thor stared at the numbers for a long moment. 4 wounded, out of 300 operators facing 40,000 hostiles in fortified terrain. Rodriguez noticed his expression. Ambassador, do you understand now why we call this the minimum standard? Kyle Thor nodded slowly, his dorsal crests bristling in a mixture of respect and primal fear. Because if this was the minimum standard, he couldn't imagine what the maximum of human capabilities represented, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to find out. 5 standard galactic years had passed since Operation Delta 6. Kyle Thor was in his private office in the Council Tower, contemplating the stars through the panoramic window as he prepared his final official report. 352 service cycles were coming to an end. Retirement awaited, and with it, time for reflection on everything he had witnessed. But his thoughts kept returning to those 300 human soldiers and what they had unleashed upon the galaxy. A communication signal interrupted his contemplations. Ambassador Victoria Chen materialized in hologram form, now with slightly graying hair, but the same determination in her eyes. Ambassador Kalthor, I hope I'm not interrupting. Ambassador Chen, always a pleasure. In fact, I was reflecting on the events that brought us here. Chen smiled, knowingly. The 5 years since Delta 6 have been transformative, haven't they? Transformative was an understatement. The operation had been documented in meticulous detail by coalition observers. The reports had circulated through all member systems, generating heated debates about what the human presence meant for the galactic balance. But it was what happened 3 months after Delta 6 that truly changed everything. Kyle Thor activated his own hologram, displaying archived headlines from galactic transmissions. The most prominent showed an image that had been replicated trillions of times across countless worlds. Captain Elizabeth Santos, commander of the terrestrial assault ship HMS Defiant, stood alone on her ship's command bridge as she deliberately collided with the capital ship of an unknown invading fleet that had attacked the Valara Prime colony. Her final transmission, sent seconds before impact, had become the most quoted speech in recent galactic history. To all species of the Coalition, humanity made an oath when we were accepted among you. We swore to defend the defenseless, protect the vulnerable, and never hesitate when innocent lives are at risk. This is not just my choice, it is our promise fulfilled. May my crew be remembered, not for how we died, but for how many we saved. 47 human crew members had died in that collision, but their actions had decapitated the enemy command, allowing the coalition fleet to arrive in time to evacuate 2,400,000 civilians. You were there, Ambassador, Chen said softly, in the wreckage of Valara Prime. You saw how the galaxy reacted. Kalthor had been there. He had seen species that had never shown public emotion openly weep as they recovered the bodies of the human crew from the wreckage. He had seen monuments erected before the debris had even cooled. He had seen the fundamental shift in how the galaxy viewed humanity, no longer as dangerous warriors to be feared, but as protectors willing to pay the ultimate price for species they barely knew. The sacrifice of Captain Santos and her crew changed the narrative, Kalthor observed. But it wasn't just that, was it? Chen shook her head. No, it was the pattern that followed. In 5 years, human forces have responded to 23 crises in coalition systems. Hostage rescues, disaster evacuations, anti-piracy operations, humanitarian aid, and in every situation, we kept our promise. Kalthor accessed statistical data he had compiled for his final report. The numbers painted an extraordinary picture. Human military operations in coalition territory, 23. Lives directly saved, 47,230,000. Human casualties in service, 1,842. Operational success rate, 97.4%. Your species lost nearly 2,000 individuals defending worlds that were not your own, Kalthor said, his voice heavy with emotion he rarely displayed. Why, Ambassador? Why continue to pay that price? Chen looked directly at him through the hologram. Because when you have the capacity to help and choose not to, you carry that weight for the rest of your life. We learned that the hard way in our own history. Genocides we could have prevented. Catastrophes we could have mitigated. Suffering we could have alleviated. Every failure taught us one lesson. Power without responsibility is the root of all evil. Admirable philosophy, but what about the personal cost? Every soldier who volunteers for service in coalition operations knows the cost and chooses to pay it. Not because they are naive or reckless, but because they found something worth more than their own lives. Purpose. Kalthor thought of young Lieutenant Marcus Way, whom he had met 3 years ago during a rescue operation on a mineral world. Way was 24 Earth years old, a graduate in engineering with honors, and could have had any career he desired. Instead, he chose Special Forces. When Kalthor asked why, the answer was simple and devastating in its sincerity. Because people need help. And I can help. Way had died 6 months later, holding a blast that would have killed 200 civilians while his team completed the evacuation. He was posthumously awarded the Coalition's highest decoration. His family received the medal with tears and pride. The galaxy has changed since Delta 6, Kalthor said, returning to the present. Forces from multiple species now request training with human instructors. Tactics you introduced are studied in military academies across 100 systems. Hostage rescue protocols you developed have saved countless lives. And yet, Chen added with a sad smile, there are still those who fear us. Fear and respect are not mutually exclusive, Ambassador, but I can testify that the balance has shifted drastically. 5 years ago, 40% of the Council would vote against human admission if the vote were repeated. Today, 92% would vote in favor, and the remaining 8% are motivated not by fear, but by internal political issues unrelated to Earth. Chen allowed herself a moment of visible satisfaction. That was the goal from the start, Ambassador. Not domination, not conquest, just a seat at the table and the opportunity to prove that strength can be wielded with compassion. An alert flashed on Kyle Thor's console. Priority transmission from the Council. He nodded to Chen. "One moment, please." The message was brief but significant. The Council had voted unanimously to establish a new military division, the Coalition Rapid Response Force, Joint Command. Multiple species, but the operational core, the elite teams that would be sent into the most dangerous crises, would be composed of human operators working as consultants and instructors for multi-species teams. And the designated commander for this new force was Commander Jessica Frost. Kyle Thor shared the news with Chen, who smiled genuinely. "Frost deserves it. She's the best we have." The galaxy agrees, but Ambassador, this represents an enormous responsibility. This force will be called upon for the most impossible situations, the missions that seem beyond the capacity for solution. "Exactly the kind of mission we train for," Chen replied, without hesitation. "Ambassador Kelthor, may I share something my grandfather, the Special Forces operator I mentioned 5 years ago, used to say?" "Please." "He used to say that the true test of a society is not measured by its capacity to win wars, but by its willingness to fight wars that are not its own to protect people it will never know. That is the legacy humanity chooses to leave among the stars." Kael'thor felt his dorsal crests bristle, not in fear as they had 5 years ago upon meeting Sergeant Hayes, but in recognition of profound truth. He had spent 3.5 centuries serving the Coalition, witnessing the best and worst of dozens of species. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had negotiated treaties that saved worlds and averted wars. But he had never seen a species that so completely embodied the duality of strength and sacrifice as the humans. "Ambassador Chen, I have one last question before finalizing my retirement report." "Yes?" "When Delta 6 occurred, I was terrified. Not because the humans were cruel or bloodthirsty, but because they were terrifyingly efficient, calculating, capable of precise violence without moral hesitation. That deeply frightened me. But 5 years later, I have watched your species consistently choose to protect rather than conquer, to sacrifice rather than dominate. What changed? Or was that always the intention?" Chen considered the question carefully before answering. "Ambassador, our efficiency in combat was never the goal. It was the tool. The goal has always been to protect those who cannot protect themselves. The precise violence you witnessed is not celebrated in our culture. It is mourned as necessary. Every soldier who returns from operations carries the weight of their actions. We honor them not because they killed, but because they chose to carry that burden so others wouldn't have to." Kael'thor finally understood. The fear he had felt upon meeting Hayes, upon witnessing Delta 6, upon watching Captain Santos sacrifice her ship, was not fear of monsters. It was fear of confronting his own inadequacy. Because humanity had mastered something most species in the galaxy still struggled to achieve, the capacity to use absolute force with absolute restraint, to possess terrible power and choose to wield it only in defense of the defenseless. "Thank you, Ambassador. Kael'thor said finally. "Your grandfather would be proud of the legacy humanity is building." "I hope so, Ambassador. I hope all of them would." When the transmission ended, Kael'thor turned back to his final report. The words flowed easily now, a distillation of 3.5 centuries of experience focused on one fundamental truth. The most powerful force in the galaxy was not measured in megatons of destructive capacity or in numbers of warships. It was measured in the willingness to sacrifice everything for principles that transcended self-preservation. And by that metric, humanity had no equal. Years later, when young diplomats asked the retired Kael'thor about his most memorable encounter in his long career, he always told the same story of 300 soldiers launched into the void in metal coffins, of a captain who steered her ship into destruction to save millions, of a species that arrived among the stars with bloodied hands but clean hearts, and of how the galaxy learned that the true protectors are not those who have never known violence. They are those who have known it intimately and chose every day to use that knowledge only to protect the peace everyone deserved. Humanity had become the sentinels of the stars. Not because they were the strongest, or the oldest, or the wisest, but because when the galaxy needed heroes willing to pay the ultimate price, the humans simply asked, "Where do you need us to be?" And that, Kael'thor always concluded, was the kind of strength that truly changed the universe. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more Chronicles from the galactic frontier. Follow the journeys of species that defy the impossible, sacrifices that save civilizations, and the discovery that true strength lies not in the power to destroy, but in the courage to protect. We'll see you among the stars, where unlikely heroes write their legacies in acts of silent bravery and unwavering humanity.